What's up, everybody? My name is Frank Dembo here from Microsoft for Startups here at Achieve More Together. Our next speaker is Carmine Gallo, three-time Wall Street Journal best-selling author and author of the book 5 Stars, The Communication Secrets to Get From Good to Great. Carmine, welcome to the conference. How are you doing today?
I'm fantastic. Thank you, Frank. This is a great opportunity to spread some positivity and optimism for startups.
Definitely. Love that. So, obviously it's an interesting time, lots of ups and downs that startups are facing. You're an expert on storytelling. What are you seeing in that market in terms of startups thinking about storytelling? Are they able to break through? Are they able to find that optimism that you're talking about?
Well, Frank, let's not forget that people like to do business with people they like. And that means this is your time to rise above, to face adversity, and to find the positive things that you can turn out of adversity. Because those are all the great stories. Great stories are made out of finding struggle and hardship and then transforming and coming out the other side. That is pretty much the model of all great stories. So this is when great stories are made. And so many of the leaders who I have written about and who I follow and many who I've met, they've started their startups in times of crisis or the hardship or some of the toughest recessions we've had. 1968 is when Intel started. I know a number of great startups that started in 2001, 2008. So it's always good to remember, Frank, that I write about persuasive leaders. I write about leaders who inspire, who motivate, who move people to action. More often than not, in fact, in almost every case, even throughout history, those leaders are positive, energetic, and optimistic. So I know it's easy to be optimistic when times are good. It's really hard to be optimistic when times are bad, but those are the kind of leaders we gravitate to.
Interesting. Yeah, that's amazing. In terms of keeping that storytelling ethos, a lot of entrepreneurs don't necessarily think of themselves as storytellers. How do you develop that if that's not something natural for you?
Oh, storytelling is everything. And I understand it. I'm more on the creative side. My background is journalism. I was 15 years in the journalism field. And so I'm a writer. So storytelling is something that connects with me, but I understand that to a lot of business professionals in a number of different fields, storytelling is not something that they think they're doing. And yet we're all storytellers. Storytelling is how the mind is wired. We are physically wired, hardwired for story. We think in narrative, we process our world in metaphor and in narrative, and we communicate in story form, and we want our information communicated in narrative or story form. So this is something that storytelling is something that we all do. When you tell an origin story, for example, about your company, how it got started, what problems is it solving? When you tell a customer case study, what are you doing, Frank? I mean, that is telling a story. So if that's all we're doing all the time anyway, is telling narratives and stories, it's a good idea to understand the formula that all great stories follow, the formula that great stories have followed since the beginning of time. So it's very important to understand and study how persuasion happens, and it cannot happen in the absence of story.
And that formula that you're talking about, obviously you go into it a little bit more in some of your books, but can you give people who are new to storytelling just a couple of tips on how they can implement some of those techniques that you've been teaching some of these great leaders for a long time?
Yeah, well, first of all, let's go back in time. I won't take you back too far, just a few 100,000 years. When our anthropologists have told me this, and it's fascinating, when our ancestors gained control of fire, it was a major milestone in human development. Our brains got bigger because we could eat food, it warded off predators, but people gathered around a campfire and began sharing stories. Stories informed, stories educated, stories warned people, and stories inspired. We still do the same thing today. When you're using Microsoft Teams, for example, and you are on a virtual conversation, we're just around a virtual campfire, but nothing has really changed except the technology. The way the brain processes information is still the same. We are still looking to each other to tell and share stories. So let's be practical for all of the startup entrepreneurs who are watching this today. There are three, well, actually, there are more than three types of stories, but if you give me a few seconds, let me talk about the three that are the most impactful, the three types of stories. Number one, personal stories. So when you are talking to teams, when you are talking to employees, stakeholders, potential customers, those personal stories are the most impactful. And those are the anecdotes and the examples that come from your personal life. Maybe these days, especially in the area of coronavirus and COVID, sometimes it's important to remind people of what your values are and what your company's values are. Well, when I wrote one of my first books, I've written about 10 books, 5 stars is my 10th. When I wrote one of my first books, I interviewed Howard Schultz, who was really the founder and the CEO of Starbucks. He's no longer the CEO, but he was running Starbucks at the time. Yeah. And he was very fond of talking about a story that actually had a lot of struggle and hardship. It was a personal story of when he was growing up poor in a Brooklyn housing project. Yeah. Remember? Yeah. So you've heard that story because he repeats it quite often. And that's the story of his father being hurt on the job. They didn't have health insurance or workers' comp or a safety net. And that's why Starbucks became the very first major company to offer full-time health benefits to part-time workers. And stock options and all that. The point is, he tells that story of hardship and struggle in his personal life to reflect the values of his company. Now more than ever, people need to understand what your values are. And sometimes it's those personal stories of why you started your company or some of the hardships and struggles that you've overcome and succeeded at.
And I know you have two other points to that, but I just want to delve into that point a little bit more because I think there's an element of what you said that relates to authenticity, being able to tell a really raw, authentic story that may not be easy for most people to tell. Mm-hmm. How do you get leaders to get the courage to share those stories? Because I know a lot of folks are dealing with, people in their family have passed away or they've had to deal with other negative things in their life, but they're trying to power through and get that optimism that we're talking about. How do you do that? That's not easy for everyone.
Yeah, Frank, what's very interesting to me is, remember, I've been studying persuasion for about 20 years, and I've been working directly with CEOs and successful entrepreneurs for at least 15 years now. Those who are the most successful are typically those entrepreneurs who are open and transparent and willing to talk about those personal struggles that they've had and how they've overcome those struggles. When I spoke, I've interviewed Richard Branson 3 times now, and almost every time
he's my favorite billionaire.
He's authentic. He is what you would expect from him. And Richard Branson is very open about talking about his early failures, about how he overcame dyslexia, and how dyslexia he saw as something that was damaging early on, and now he realized it was actually a gift. So he's very open with talking about failures and personal hardships that he's had to overcome. Those are the type of stories that connect us to one another. But when you're, I don't know if it's younger, but when you're younger and maybe you're not as confident in who you are, it's harder to reach that stage. And yet some of the most successful people are very open about the failures they've encountered, because we've all had failures or hardships or uncertainties. It's okay to be uncertain in this time, as long as you have a plan for dealing with potential outcomes.
Right. Because sometimes it's hard. It's hard when you're going through it. Sometimes it's hard when you're actually still in it. Like, you don't feel like you've gotten to that final point to tell this like heroic story. But I see your point. And that's okay.
We're still in the middle of that journey, and that's okay. But these are the times when those stories are being made. You're in the middle of your hero's journey. Every great novel and story from the beginning of time follows a pattern. It's called the hero's journey. We won't get into it. It gets quite detailed. But the hero's journey is simply about a hero who is living a normal life, and all of a sudden something really bad happens, and that hero finds his inner strength and transforms either him or herself or the world or a field or an industry. That's called the hero's journey. All great stories follow the hero's journey.
Yeah.
Your hero's journey is being built now.
Yeah.
But often those personal stories don't have to be about what's happening now. They can certainly be about another time in your past when you've had a significant hurdle or struggle to overcome. Because it is in those times of adversity that heroes rise. And we all love hearing stories of someone struggling, overcoming a hardship, and triumph and succeeding at the end. That's the classic story. And we need those stories more than ever. That's why optimistic heroes, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, a lot of optimists, even during the worst of times, were able to find those stories from their past or historical stories that pointed to a bright future. People want leaders who are optimistic. It's hard, but the fact that you're an entrepreneur, you already stand apart. Most people don't have the courage to do that. So people look to you for that feeling of optimism and positivity. It's just, you have to be the one to do that.
So amazing stuff. So the first type of story you said is a personal story. I think you said there are 3 main archetypes. What are the other 2 that people should be thinking about in their
brand? Yeah, number 2 is brand story or case studies. Okay, these are stories about other people. We all have case studies. Those are really important, especially in B2B. I've seen research. I do a lot of research in B2B in the sector. I've seen research where B2B customers want to hear more customer stories. So it's not all about the product and the service and the features. It's how that product is serving a real need. Let me give you an example from another company in your field. See, that's a case study. You can also look at brand stories. Brand stories are fascinating to me. Let's take Nike, for example. Why do you think Phil Knight, for many, many years, for decades, always told the story of how Nike shoes started from selling shoes in the back of his Plymouth Valiant, even out of a specific car he talked about, right? Because it's all about innovation and grittiness and resilience. It was one story from Nike's past that showed how innovative and gritty and resilient that company really is. He also told the waffle iron story about how Nike's co-founder saw a waffle iron on his kitchen and decided that maybe that's got the best grip for a running shoe. So he started experimenting with a waffle iron. When you walk into the Nike museum, I've done a lot of research on Nike. When you walk into their museum up in Oregon, you'll see the original waffle iron, because that's part of the story. It's part of the brand narrative. So those type of stories are also very important. But can I tell you one, Frank, that I've noticed among really good leaders, especially during COVID? It doesn't happen a lot, but if you can tell these stories well, they're extremely effective. They're called symbol stories. Symbol stories. So they're not really personal stories. They're not brand stories. They're not customer stories. They're stories that act as a metaphor for what we're going through now. Let me give you an example. There's a politician who is obviously, like all politicians, he's criticized sometimes and he's praised, and that's Andrew Cuomo in New York, the governor of New York.
Definitely.
So he's giving a daily coronavirus briefings, and he's widely admired for strength of communication. He's a very good communicator. He tells what are called symbol stories. For example, a few weeks ago, he was talking about how are we going to reopen? How are we going to get from lockdown to reopening? And then what is New York going to look like from today through 18 months from now, when we may or may not get a vaccine? How are we going to bridge that gap? And he said, I know it may seem unlikely today, but a few years ago, he said, when I became governor, there was a bridge in Brooklyn or over the Hudson River, I think. I don't live there. Over the Hudson River.
To Jersey.
It's called the Tappan Zee Bridge. You may be more familiar with it than I am. Tappan Zee
Yeah.
Bridge.
Yeah, I know
So he
Tappan
said
Zee.
the Tappan Zee Bridge was something that for 20 years people wanted to repair, but nobody got it done. And they didn't get it done because they think it couldn't be done. That it was environmentally sensitive, that it just was too complicated to repair. And he walked in and he said, no, let's get this done. And if we had to get it done, what are the things that we would have to have in place? And so once he started asking the questions and challenging people, they got it done. And not too long ago, they reopened the brand new Tappan Zee Bridge. But what he said is, that is a symbol to me of how we can bridge from today to 18 months. If we just think about let's not think about how we can't do it. Let's think about and address how do we do it, and how do we do it safely and responsibly.
Giving them an example they can latch onto of something they've already experienced or they understand, and then using that as a bridge for some new type of communication.
So Frank, do you see how that's not a personal story? It's not like a personal anecdote, but it's a larger story that symbolizes where an abstract concept.
Right.
That you want to take me to. So that's the point. If you look at anyone like, even like Andrew Cuomo, for example, anyone who you see and consider a good communicator, more often than not, probably in every example, you will notice that they are storytellers first. Yeah. Storytelling is absolutely critical. Most of the venture capitalists I talk to who fund some of the biggest startups of our time, the people who funded Airbnb, Sequoia Capital, Andreessen Horowitz. I talk to venture capitalists for years. I write about them in my books. Almost every single one says storytelling is your competitive advantage. You got to learn how to do it well.
And you talked about case studies, and I think especially for B2B, it's helpful for a customer to see themselves in another customer. I experienced this in my last startup. I had a very well-known startup as one of my examples, and one of their closest competitors said, well, if you're good enough for them, then we'll use you as well. And it's interesting how that plays out. But are there any kind of quick tips you can give people on creating those case studies? Are there kind of must-have elements of that case study that you need to think about in order to make sure that it's going to be something that really matches and resonates?
Frank, the beauty of storytelling is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We know how this is done from the beginning of time. Great stories follow a formula. So we don't have to reinvent anything here, Frank. Okay, so here is the formula that all stories follow, okay, with the hero's journey, but I'm going to keep it really, really simple. Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Every time you go to a movie, every great movie that's box office success has Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Act 1 is the status quo. These are the characters' lives today. Star Wars, perfect example, falls into a perfect three-part structure. Here's Luke Skywalker. Here's what happened to his family. Here's where he lives. Here's what he does. So that's the status quo. Act 2 is the next hour of a film. That's where all the action happens. That's where a villain is introduced. Hurdles are introduced. Heroes have to overcome the hurdles. And Act 3 is the resolution, the transformation. Everyone lives happily ever after. So think about a case study as Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. So Act 1 is, this is the state of the world today, or this is the world that this other customer was experiencing when we started working with the customer. This was their state of the world. These were the challenges. Act 2, these are the challenges that they experienced. And then this is how our product or our service or my idea helped them overcome that challenge and transform the world, their industry, their business, their department, what have you. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. It's a beautiful structure. It's thousands of years old. Use it too. We don't have to reinvent storytelling here, Frank.
With you on that. So we have personal stories that show some vulnerability and authentic experiences. We have these case studies and maybe reference stories to use as kind of analogies for people to latch onto. What's the third type of story that you have identified?
Okay, so the first was personal. The second is a case study. I'm going to give you four. The third is the brand story that I told you about, like Nike and the waffle iron. That's more reflective of the brand. It doesn't fall under personal. And then I think the fourth could be symbol stories.
Okay.
Within those four, let's pick those four: personal stories, a case study, a brand story, how your brand was started, or a founder who started that brand, and symbol stories, like I told you, Andrew Cuomo is an example. If you look at all great stories in corporate America, or just in corporations in general, they typically fall under one of those four. Yeah. There's a few others, but most stories will fall under one of those four.
And I'm sure you have to adjust how you tell these stories, where you tell these stories, and especially with the context of what's happening. How can people adjust to the times? Are there any tips and tricks you can think of for a startup that's B2B, that's trying to close sales through this time, is trying to communicate a message about their product, but there's a macro environment that they have to work within? How do they need to adjust to not sounding authentic or insensitive?
Let's remember that, again, people buy products, or they do business with people who they like. So this is all about building relationships, showing empathy, being likable, charismatic, being a good communicator. The hard truth is that soft skills matter, and they matter more than ever. So this is the time when you don't want to necessarily be doing the hard sell, right, but building those relationships and being authentic and showing empathy, because we all know that people want to do business with people they like. So this is one of those times, especially in a crisis, where I think it's more important to build relationships, build strong relationships, and have people see that you're the kind of leader that they want to be in the foxhole with, that they want to be with long term. That's why I think these stories are very important to tell, even if at the end of it, there's not always a call to action immediately. Exactly. But it's to build that empathy with one another. Don't forget that there's something, Frank, that I learned many books ago. One of my earliest books was The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs. It was the first book on how Steve Jobs, who I believe was the greatest corporate storyteller of our time, how Steve Jobs delivered these phenomenal presentations. He went through all the stages we just talked to, the 3-act structure, everything about storytelling. But there was something I learned from former Apple executives who worked with him. I'll never forget this, and I think it applies today more than ever. Sell dreams, not products. Sell dreams, not products. In other words, Steve Jobs had this amazing ability to understand that you were selling a feeling. People wanted to do business with you or buy your products because of the way it made them feel. No one cares about your commission during COVID. No one cares about your success as a company necessarily. They care about themselves. Okay, we all do. Right. We're egocentric, right? Yeah, if we weren't that egocentric, social media wouldn't be as popular as it is. We love our selfies. So, but that's just human nature. So we are consumed with our own hopes, our own dreams, our own uncertainties to an extent, our own fears. Show people how your knowledge, your expertise, your company, your product, your service can help them accomplish their dreams or give them a feeling of certainty or confidence. And that's how you'll win people over. Again, what a brilliant way of communicating. That's why Apple became Apple, because Steve Jobs understood that people don't buy products. They buy a feeling, and they buy into a dream of a better world for themselves. They're more creative. They're unleashing their creativity or their potential. That's the feeling that he was trying to get across. I think more than ever, great communicators are people who can instill those feelings in people right now.
Totally. This is amazing stuff. Thank you so much, Carmine. And just to wrap it up, I would love to get your kind of words of advice or final words of encouragement for all the entrepreneurs out there that are watching this, that are fixing up their marketing, fixing up their storytelling. what can you say to them to think about looking forward in the future?
In the first part of my book, 5 Stars, I wrote about the fact that persuasion matters today more than ever. Ideas are the currency of the 21st century. No longer is your value wrapped up in the land as it was during the agrarian age. No longer is your value wrapped up on the factory line as it was during the Industrial Revolution. We all know this instinctively, intuitively. We understand that our ideas have value. But if you cannot express your ideas in a way that inspires people, that connects with people, that moves them to action, then ultimately you will not be nearly as successful as you could be. In my experience, the great communicators are the ones who stand out. They're the ones who close the deals, make sales, get jobs that maybe on paper they weren't necessarily as qualified as another person, but they're the better communicator. So communication skills now are more important than ever, especially in an age of ideas. When your value is tied up in your ideas, you have to be able to communicate your ideas more effectively, and that's your competitive edge.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Carmine. Really thoughtful advice. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back with more from Achieve More Together in a few moments.
Thank you, Frank.